Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're continuing our look into free will, looking at what is hard determinism. Now, hard determinism, sometimes just called determinism, is the view that any state of affairs is perfectly determined by the previous state of affairs, and that this means free will does not exist. For the broad position just called determinism that only asserts the first half of this, check out the previous video we looked at. Hard determinism is something of a boogeyman in the free will debate. It is an intuitive but frightening proposition. Libertarianism and compatibilism have been constructed to challenge the two intuitive propositions that lead to the conclusion that free will does not exist. So, our trilemma once again goes as follows. The universe follows deterministic laws. Free will is the ability to do otherwise, according to those laws, to act other than you were predetermined to, and free will exists. You can't hold all three of these. Hard determinism, what we're looking at here, is the position that denies the third premise. It claims that free will does not exist. Compatibilism, or soft determinism, is the position that denies the second premise. We're going to look at that in a couple of videos. And libertarianism, that we already looked at, is the position that denies the first premise. So, in our video on determinism, we looked at arguments for premise 1. And in the video on incompatibilism, we're going to look at arguments for premise 2. So we have some arguments for each of those premises independently. In this video, however, we're going to focus on arguments to defend the final premise, to defend, well, the denial, rather, of the final premise, to defend the case that free will does not exist. Because that's the claim that makes hard determinism unique amongst all of the positions on free will. Hard determinism is the one that asserts there is no free will. Everyone else, to a certain extent, at least leaves the door open for there to be free will. Here, we will look at the case for the claim that there is no free will. From a metaphysical standpoint, hard determinism has the easiest case to make. It's not arguing for magical powers to break causality, as libertarians are, or for a strange, complicated, and counterintuitive definition of free will, as compatibilists are. It is arguing from a strict metaphysical, free will is basically what you think free will is, the ability to make a choice, and the world behaves according to deterministic laws, and so free will doesn't exist. The challenge for hard determinism then doesn't really come from metaphysics, it comes from another branch of philosophy, ethics. If we have no free will, then there's a question of how we can be morally responsible for our actions. If our brains are nothing more than complex chemical reactions, then how can we be more morally responsible than a fire is responsible, or an explosion is responsible? There are two responses that the hard determinists might offer that we'll look at here. One is to provide a defense of what's called moral responsibility skepticism. In other words, defend the claim that moral responsibility simply does not exist. Free will it agrees with the claim, free will is tied to moral responsibility, but denies the claim that moral responsibility even exists at all. The other is to argue that moral responsibility does not require free will. It's to say, sure, moral responsibility exists, but you don't have to have free will to be morally responsible for your actions. We don't have free will, but you are morally responsible. This position verges on compatibilism and gets a little bit into the gray there, though I would argue that it is a version of hard determinism because it does assert that free will is the ability to do otherwise. We do not have free will because the world is deterministic. It simply breaks apart the connection between moral responsibility and free will. So we'll look at each alternative in turn. First off, moral responsibility skepticism is the claim that humans are never morally responsible for their actions. One famous argument for this position is offered by Galen Strawson's quote-unquote basic argument. Basically, this argument claims that premise 1, nothing is its own cause, so you can't cause yourself because you need a cause and an effect, and every effect is determined by its cause, and an effect can't cause itself because then we wouldn't be determined as to what it would be. It breaks the principle of causality. Premise 2, to be ultimately morally responsible, one must be the ultimate cause of one's own mental states, and therefore you cannot be morally responsible, because you are not the ultimate cause of your own mental states, because you can't cause yourself. You can't be your own cause. Your mental states are caused by other things. And in order for you to be morally responsible for those mental states, you need to cause those mental states, not the environment around you, your parents, the culture you were brought up in, and so on and so forth. There are a range of objections that have been raised to this argument. Broadly, libertarians argue against the first premise, claiming that we can cause ourselves in some spookily metaphysical way, and compatibilists argue against the second premise, claiming that we can draw a line between physical causes and free will, i.e. you can have free will, but not physically cause your own mental states. Another argument, which preserves ethics while maintaining hard determinism, is to claim that moral responsibility can be in some way divorced from free will. You can have moral responsibility, but not free will. This is the claim that even if you do not freely choose your choices, and free will is defined as the ability to freely choose your choices, they may still be right or wrong, and you can still be morally responsible. Exactly how this works out depends on your position on normative ethics, but here's an example of one way to preserve ethics even without free will. So take a consequentialist point of view. You might claim that actions are right or wrong based on the amount of pleasure or pain that they cause. Under such a framework, you might make the case that even unintended consequences count. In other words, if you kill someone while driving drunk, you are still morally responsible, even if you never meant to kill them. The act of killing is still immoral, and you bear moral responsibility, even if you did not freely choose to do so. A politician whose inaction in a crisis results in many deaths is morally responsible for those deaths, even if they never made a free choice to kill those people or never intended to kill those people. Even if they never took the choice as an action, their inaction, despite it not being a free choice, still leaves them morally responsible. Therefore, you can have moral responsibility even if you never make a free choice, or even if you never take a free action. If this is the case, if we can squeeze apart moral responsibility and free will, we can claim you do not have free will, but you're still morally responsible. Under such a framework, free will is not required for moral responsibility. It seems that we are morally responsible even for things that we do not choose to do. You may never make a conscious choice to fall asleep at the wheel, but you're responsible for the people you injure and kill. If people bear moral responsibility for things that they do not freely choose to do, it seems that free will is not required for moral responsibility. Simply a definition of which actions are moral or immoral. If you have that definition of morality, you don't need free will to determine who can be held morally accountable. You might be concerned with this position for a number of reasons. You might think that the morality of an action depends on something other than its consequences, like an internal mental states of the individual undertaking it. You might think that not implementing a policy is just as much a choice as implementing it, even if you never reflectively took that choice, though this is going to run into some definitions of free will, both in terms of compatibilism and libertarianism, that want you to have some level of kind of conscious effort going into a choice. Exactly how you respond to this argument will depend on your own view on normative ethics. There's also a certain question around what then could be given moral responsibility if we don't have an agent at an end of a chain of causal events. What is given moral responsibility? Why is it not the case that an explosion is morally responsible but a person is? And you could create some story of this, that it's not about free will, that it's about moral status, that it's about something else that requires that moral responsibility to maintain the position that free will and moral responsibility are importantly separate. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at the disjunctive position that is somewhat made up, called freedomism. What is freedomism? This is the position that denies and hard determinism and claims that free will does exist. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Go ahead and subscribe. Hit that notification bell if you want to stay up on all of the videos that we're publishing, and make sure you see this next video in the series when it comes out. And stay skeptical, everybody.